All right, welcome back to the channel. So it is now official that, or at least it has been announced by both Gary Russell Jr.'s team and Devin Haney's team, that Gary Russell and Devin Haney will be fighting each other. It is expected to take place in December and on DAZN in a negotiation that was very, very easy, not difficult. And so we should get an unexpectedly great fight in December. In talking about it, though, Gary Russell Jr. talks about his desire after Devin Haney to still fight Terence Crawford and talks about at length the weaknesses of Terence Crawford and why Terence Crawford is massively overrated. Let's talk about the Devin Haney fight a little bit, but also get into the Gary Russell Jr. and Terence Crawford thing in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, first things first, First things first, for everybody that thought Gary Russell Jr. was cap, I'm using the word cap in a sentence correctly. Everybody that thought Gary Russell Jr. was cap for saying that he wanted to fight Terence Crawford, you can all go outside, drive around your neighborhood, look for a crow that got hit by a car, pick it up, fry it, and eat it, okay? Because Gary Russell Jr. proved two things in the negotiation with Devin Haney's team, and that you saw on this channel in real time, that Gary Russell Jr. is one of the easiest people that you could possibly negotiate with, because he tells you what he wants, and if you give him what he wants, he agrees to the fight and he moves forward. Unfortunately, that is not the case with guys like Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford's got all kind of stuff wrapped up with him. If you don't have a belt, I can't fight you. If you lost to somebody that has a belt, I can't fight you. If you're under 5'6", I can't fight you. If you're over 6'1", I can't fight you. If you speak French but not Italian, I can't fight you. All kind of excuses for Terence Crawford not fighting somebody, because he is acting like people can't. What he's doing, he's acting like people can't see. You're trying to sit in the place that you are. You're trying to sit in the catbird seat until Errol Spence Jr. gets done with everything else sorting out so you can fight him. Gary Russell Jr. still maintains that after he fights Devin Haney, that he wants to go and fight Terence Crawford. So he was interviewed on the Boxing Voice. Very interesting, okay? Very interesting interview. And since you guys are this deep into the interview, let me tell you, I find it really, really interesting that media that claim that another type of media doesn't give them their just due for the things that they do will take what another media channel does in the same situation as them and do the same thing to them and have a conversation for 2 hours without ever mentioning how you got this information and why you know about it. It's really interesting that certain people that are, say, one type of media doesn't support the other type of media, when they put out videos about what people in the LDBC do, don't say or mention the channel that they got the information from or the channels at all, and claim that the fight showed up out of nowhere. So let's just say for now, dude, that there is really only one type of media that I know of. If that sounds harsh, it is what it is. Okay. However, back to the subject matter. It's back to the subject matter at hand. Devin Haney proved that Gary Russell Jr. is somebody that is easy to negotiate with. In the conversation that they had on another boxing channel, when Gary Russell Jr. was interviewed, Gary Russell Jr. goes into exactly why he thinks that he can beat Terence Crawford. And those type of conversations are something that I think people should really sit down and listen to. Because Gary Russell Jr. being a world-class fighter, right? Now he's a small guy, 5'5", right? Small guy, around the same size as Manny Pacquiao, right? Around the same size as Manny Pacquiao, the same height and basically dimensions is a guy like Gervonta Tank Davis, maybe a little smaller in the dimensions than he. However, this guy is clearly one of the best fighters in boxing, and listen to him break down Terence Crawford and the way Terence Crawford fights was intriguing. He says that Terence Crawford is sloppy. He's like, man, this dude is sloppy. I don't know what you guys are looking at. Look at these wide punches that he's throwing. He's like, yeah, he wound up knocking this guy out, but he knocked that guy out with some really wild, sloppy punch that if somebody was of the same skill set as he, that they would not get hit with that same punch, right? And he predicted that Terence Crawford, when he runs into the big guys at the welterweight division, is going to get knocked out because guys can respond to the weaknesses and loopholes, to the vulnerabilities that he has because they have the skill set to do it. But he was like, Terence Crawford doesn't want to fight all those guys because Terence Crawford knows and his team knows that he's chinny and that technically speaking, he's sloppy. So, man, dude, I was like, wow. Like, I had never heard another professional fighter break down Terence Crawford like that and talk about how sloppy he was. Now, if this was just anybody, right, saying it, right, then I might be like, okay, I don't, you just might be hating on Bud. But if you've ever seen Gary Russell Jr. fight, you'll see that Gary Russell Jr. does not do the things that he's accusing Terence Crawford of doing. And Terence and Gary Russell Jr. is like straight, like, dude, I'm a better boxer than Terence Crawford is. So what it looks like he's saying about Terence Crawford, or the result of that is, at least the impression it makes upon me, is that he's saying, look, Terence Crawford is fighting a bunch of bums. He's fighting not bums, but lower level fighters. He's a great athlete, right? So he has the ability to pull out and win fights. But what people are saying about his technical skills and all that stuff, and he's like, in pound for pound, he's like, nah, man. He's like, nah, man, he is not that. Now, if you go back and you look at like the history of Terence Crawford, right? And like, why did Terence Crawford wind up not being signed by a promoter coming out of the amateurs, right? Now, by a major promoter coming out of the amateurs, like what would that be, right? Why would that be? You have guys like Danny Garcia I don't think Danny Garcia went to the Olympics, and he's coming out of Philadelphia, right? So he's kind of got that Philadelphia school. So maybe, that relationship is how he wound up getting signed. But it just makes me wonder that maybe some of the things that Gary Russell Jr. is saying and seeing might be some of the reasons that people were looking at him in the amateurs and saying, nah, I don't really know about that. But the thing about when you get signed with Top Rank is that all of those type of flaws can be covered up by Top Rank, by matchmaking, right? And you see this on a regular basis, man, where they put guys in there with fighter. They put guys in there with guys that where they're interested in seeing a fight that is an entertaining fight, right? They want an entertaining fight, but they want an entertaining fight that their guy can win. So that's what you wind up getting with Terence Crawford. That's what it looks like with Terence Crawford. And I think that is also why it pans out in his knockout record, right? Like when he was fighting guys that he couldn't pick. Think about this. When Terence Crawford was fighting guys that he could not choose, some of those guys didn't get knocked out. He didn't choose Breidis Prescott. He was the last minute replacement for Breidis Prescott. He didn't choose Breidis Prescott. That went the distance. Ricky Burns was the champion. Terence Crawford did not pick Ricky Burns. Ricky Burns picked Terence Crawford and allowed Terence Crawford to have that championship fight. What happened to that fight? Terence Crawford won the fight. He's a much better athlete, beat Ricky Burns, but it went the distance, right? Same thing with Raimundo Beltran, right? Went the distance. But once Terence Crawford was in the championship position, right? In the championship position where he was the guy and Bob Arum was the guy that was going to get Terence Crawford his opponents, the opponents that he has selected, they all wind up getting knocked out because they were selected opponents. And that's what Gary Russell Jr. is saying about the matchmaking. So, I mean, I just find the whole thing interesting because, as I look at Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney, and I'm listening to Gary Russell Jr.'s team talk to Devin Haney's team, and I'm looking at this matchup and I'm like, man, Gary Russell Jr. really does have a point, man. Like, this fight with Devin Haney is a young, inexperienced fighter, a big, young, inexperienced fighter with a young experience, with a older but not old, very mature vet. And when I listened to the way that Gary Russell Jr. broke down Devin Haney, and I was like, man, you guys can't, if Devin Haney or Terence Crawford cannot beat Gary Russell Jr. off just straight power and just bowling over him because he's the littler guy, they could lose that fight, or they can get embarrassed because they could just have to try to win the fight sticking a jab on the outside. But even with trying to stick Gary Russell Jr. with a jab and keep him on the outside, dog, I don't know if they're fast enough to do that to keep Gary Russell Jr. from slipping their jabs, man. I just don't know. But it's going to be interesting, man. And at the end of it, dude, though, Gary Russell Jr. is looking really, really good, man. And I'm really happy that he got that fight. Devin Haney got the fight he's looking for, has an opportunity to really put himself on the map in a big way. And then Terence Crawford out here looking like a chump. There's this other way, no way around it, dog. These guys, when Gary Russell Jr. was in Terence Crawford's face, this dude went and made a fight that ain't much less difficult with Devin Haney. The size difference isn't much different because Devin Haney's a big dude. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Devin Haney and Terence Crawford are roughly the same size. And also, Gary Russell Jr. said, man, Terence Crawford ain't no real welterweight. So it's not like I'm moving up to fight Errol Spence Jr. But all of that stuff, man, is interesting. Oh, if Gary Russell Jr. is able to get out of the Devin Haney fight, then dude, and he's able to go up and win a 135-pound championship, the WBC 135-pound championship, dude, for real, I don't want to hear nada about Terence Crawford saying he can't take that fight, man. Because it's better than Kell Brook. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.